everyone. My name is Pratibha Singh. I'm currently based in Pōneke, Aotearoa, and I'm HRMI Survey Engagement Operations Lead. So I work quite closely with our ambassadors across the Pacific.
Kia ora, thanks Pratibha. I believe that we have Jennifer. Malo Lovelace Soifua. Jennifer, over to you.
Talofa, my name is Jennifer. I'm an intern for the Human Rights Measurement Initiative in Samoa, and I'm currently studying law in second year.
Malo whawhetai, Jennifer. And we also have Fatima on the call. Talofa Fatima, Tai Amanuia from Okilangi.
Hello again, hi everyone. My name is Fatima Ayo, and I am an intern with Human Rights National here in Papua. And I am a final year Benjamin Finance student. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. So these are the people who will be addressing you as well as myself in today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Seota Afili Dr. Patrick Thompson. Seota Afili is my swafa matai, or chiefly title bestowed upon me by my family in the village of Tauk Este in Apia. So you probably already realize I'm a proud Samoan who recently just returned from Samoa, and I wish I was still in Samoa, but I returned to Auckland where my home is and where I currently work as a senior lecturer in global studies at the University of Auckland. I've been the Pacific Data co-lead with one of my colleagues since early 2020. And in this time, my research has been focused a lot on Pacific Rainbow Plus communities in Aotearoa. In my role as Pacific Data co-lead, it's been an absolute joy to be able to help facilitate HRMI's work in the Pacific. Work that, to HRMI's credit, has always been led by Pacific people and voices. But before I get carried away, I also wanted to introduce my Pacific Data co-lead, Dr. Sam Manuela, who is of Kuki Airani descent. Shout out to the beautiful Cook Islands. Sam cannot be here today as he is currently making his way across our beautiful Moana Pacific Ocean to the Cook Islands as we speak. So Sam has had unfortunate luck with flights and could not take a flight out to the Cooks at another time. He will, however, be present at the Pacific Ambassador Talanoa that follows this session in a couple of hours. Dr. Sam Manuela is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Auckland and also part-time professional athlete of some description. Sam and I took on this role together as his research and training is in bridging the gap between quantitative research methods and methodologies with Pacific ways of knowing and being. So he's currently leading a Marsden-funded project that looks at developing Pacific psychologies and a Health Research Council of New Zealand project that looks at mental health in the Cook Islands. So I believe Sam is a bigger fan of Beyonce than he is of Mariah, but I guess we'll forgive him for that because I do love Beyonce too. In any case, I digress. So getting back to the reason that we're here today, and that's to launch the Pacific Module Data for 2022. Before we move on, I'd like to remind everyone that's tuned into our webinar this morning to feel free to pop questions into the Q&A box. In our program, we have 2 specific slots for Q&A that will run at the end of the first part of the webinar. So just like last year, if you came to the launch last year, our webinar is divided into 2 sections. After the first half, we'll have a quick break, but just before then, we'll have a Q&A section. And then at the end of the second part of our webinar, at the conclusion, we'll also have another Q&A session where we'll be responding to your questions. Now, please feel free to pop a question in at any time while the webinar is running. So on to the next section. Although I'm sure many of you are familiar with the HRMI Pacific module story, there's likely to be quite a few of you out there who are discovering the HRMI data and Pacific module for the first time. At this stage, I'd like to go over a little bit of history and background surrounding HRMI's Pacific module to provide context as to why we collect the data the way that we do, and also how we arrived at the shape of the Pacific module today. Now, HRMI is an organization that was founded by Anne-Marie Brooke, based here in Aotearoa, with Chad Clay at the University of Georgia, who's both of them are on this call, and Susan Randolph at the University of Connecticut. Anne-Marie tells a wonderful story about what motivated her and her co-founders to establish HRMI. So Anne-Marie, seeing you're on the call at the moment, I wonder if you could tell us specifically what sort of motivated you to found HRMI and establish HRMI with Susan and Chad, if you don't mind.
Kia ora, Patrick, very happy to, and hello everyone, it's lovely to be here. So my background is I trained as an economist, and I worked for the first 2 decades of my career giving economic policy advice to governments. So that was particularly around, what policies they needed to introduce to make the economy work better. And for a good time in the 2000s, I was working at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD in Paris, giving advice to different governments around the world. And some of the countries I was working to had some really obvious human rights challenges. And I now realize that every country has very obvious human rights challenges if you know where to look for them. And I was trying to figure out a way of bringing those human rights issues into the advice that I was giving governments. Because fundamentally, I believe that if you're not empowering people to live their best lives, then that's not going to be great for economic performance or innovation and so forth. And I found that it was really challenging to do, basically because human rights are so politically sensitive. It makes it very difficult to bring them up in that kind of economic policy advice context. But some of the advice I got from the directors at the OECD when I started asking them about it was, well, if you've got data, human rights data, then that will make it easier, because then you can include those data in a kind of more analytical kind of framework, which kind of takes out some of the heat of the political sensitivity. For example, if I was to talk about an anecdote of a journalist being, arrested for criticizing the government, that wouldn't be allowed, but including data on the press freedom, for example, in a country would be permitted. So that's really what kicked off my search for good human rights data. And I found Chad and Susan as part of that search, and the 3 of us got together and decided that we would co-found an organization, which we ended up calling the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, or HRMI for short. And the job of HRMI really is to help people see the world through a human rights lens. So we want to provide data tracking all rights as set out in international human rights law for all countries in the world, and help to enable people everywhere to use those data to bring about positive change. So that's my story. Patrick, back to you.
Right, thanks, Anne-Marie, that was great. And sort of just kind of building from there, I guess the vision of having comparable and regular data around human rights also motivated the team to think about how the work that HRMI does could be extended into the Pacific, right, which is where we are today. And as such, thinking about how best to develop human rights measurements in the region. And so I think what's important to understand about the way HRMI developed its Pacific module was that actually this was done through a Pacific co-design workshop, where you see a photo up here that was requested by Pacific participants. And this was actually held on my campus in 2019 at the University of Auckland. This picture is from in front of University of Auckland's marae, or Waipapa marae. And this co-design workshop brought together the defenders and advocates of Pacific heritage from around the region, which sought their advice on the best way that they felt that HRMI's work could be expanded to include 21 countries within the Pacific region. Now, this meeting and what was to become the initial sort of Pacific module was funded by New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade at the time, which we're very, very grateful for. And I do believe that we have some representatives from INFAT here today. So we'd just like to acknowledge INFAT for the support. We are, of course, now excited to be entering a new phase of funding to continue the Pacific module, which has been provided to us by the US Embassy here in New Zealand, but more on that later. So going back to this co-design workshop, the participants from various Pacific countries and backgrounds delivered a very clear message to HRMI. They wanted a separate set of questions to be developed around some of the issues they felt were pertinent to Pacific countries and peoples. As such, they identified the following areas they felt were important for us to collect data around that resonated with our peoples in the region. Now, these areas were the effect of the climate crisis on human rights, how well Indigenous sovereignty was being protected by the state, related to this, Indigenous land rights and cultural rights. And they also wanted us to also provide spaces where human rights advocates could respond to questions around how community violence was being experienced by specific parts of our populations, namely against women and girls, people living with disabilities, the LGBTQIA+, MVP++ communities, as well as children. These were the demographic groups that participants suggested that were at a high risk of experiencing violence in our region. Now, the first pilot module was run and established in 2020 with a second iteration of the module attached to the main HRMI expert respondent survey in 2021. And data for 2022 is now available for you all to review on the HRMI website and Rights Tracker, which Anne-Marie will demo for you a little later on in the session. Now, with that context in mind, I'd now like to move on to an explainer of how scores are developed for nations through an outline of the HRMI methodology. To help me demonstrate this for you all today, I'd like to invite HRMI's sort of methodology expert / lead, Dr. Chad Clay, to unmute his mic and go through a quick explainer of our survey methodology and the range of data that HRMI produces. So over to you, Chad, all the way over there in Georgia.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, happy to do so. You know, as Anne-Marie and Patrick referred to earlier, HRMI was founded in 2015 with the goal of trying to collect data that would be useful for everyone, especially for human rights practitioners, but legitimately for anybody who was interested in understanding human rights in their country and around the world a little bit better. And so our method of trying to ensure that our data were in fact useful was and remains the methodology of co-design, which Patrick referred to a little bit earlier about the co-design of our Pacific module. And so in co-design, we bring together practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders from all around the world to produce essentially everything we do, from the design of our metrics to the design of our website to the design of the visualizations you'll be seeing on the Rights Tracker later on. Thus far, we have used this methodology to develop data in 3 different areas. We have data on 5 different economic and social rights, data on 8 civil and political rights, and finally, the Pacific-focused data that we're here to focus on today. But to give you a little background on the data we have for every one of the countries that we'll be talking about, right? We have, as I said, economic and social rights data on 5 different rights, the rights to education, to food, to health, to housing, and to work. These metrics are primarily based on standardized data that are provided to international databases by countries themselves. However, according to international human rights law in this area, states are obligated to produce the best outcomes in each of these areas that they can with the resources they have in order to progressively realize the rights as they're listed. So at HRMI, we try to focus on producing income adjusted measures that ensure that we fairly compare states to what their international legal obligations would actually be in human rights law, and try to focus on who is doing the very best they can with the resources that they have and removing the bias that sort of can exist in these data from high income countries. And right now, as is shown on the slide, we have scores for around 200 countries up to our current data in 2022. Now, for civil and political rights, we cover 8 different rights. These are the rights to assembly and association, opinion and expression, political participation, and the freedoms from arbitrary or political imprisonment, forced disappearance, extrajudicial killing, the death penalty, and torture and ill treatment. Because, you know, unlike our economic and social rights, there are no international databases that are going to accurately describe and collect data on these kinds of human rights violations. We base our civil and political rights metrics on the best data available, which is the knowledge of researchers, advocates, lawyers, journalists, and others whose very work rotates around monitoring and understanding the frequency of civil and political rights abuses in their countries. We do this through a secure, anonymous online survey. And as of this year, we have scores for around 40 countries on each of these rights. Now, our Pacific module data also comes directly from this same expert survey approach. And the subjects covered, you know, in the Pacific module, as Patrick pointed out earlier, you know, were those that were prioritized by participants in our Pacific co-design workshop, as well as in Talanoa sessions held in the weeks and months after that co-design workshop. You know, within that, as Patrick pointed out earlier, we provide context on the effects of climate crisis on human rights practices throughout the Pacific, on the right to Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous land rights, and cultural rights. On those rights, we tend to provide summary statistics and provide really, as detailed as we possibly can, summaries of open-ended responses on each of those subjects that people fill out the survey give us. On the community violence and societal violence information that we collect, we utilize the exact same methodology that we use for our civil and political rights data, which is to try to create cross-nationally comparable data on violence for all the countries in our sample. Now, one thing that might stand out to you on that front is that you might ask how we are able to create sort of things that are cross-nationally comparable across countries, based on a survey. And so one of the things we do is we use fictionalized accounts, stories about countries that maybe aren't real, and describe what's happening in each of those countries, and have respondents tell us how they would have scored those countries in the same way that they score their own on the same questions that we ask them about their own countries. The reason we do this is because we don't want people to use a different interpretation for the right than they normally would. We don't want people to have to think differently about the right than they normally would. We want people to be able to speak from their own experience and with their own background. And what this allows us to do is to understand all of that in context and to understand the way people understand the right and the way people understand the question, and ultimately to use that to get scores that are comparable across countries and place everyone on the same scale while still allowing people to speak with the knowledge as they best understand it. I think that sums up our methodology on that front. I'll turn it back over to you, Patrick. I know we need to talk about some data.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I'd say, crash course on HRMI methodology, Chad. Super informative and useful reminder, even for me, of the amazing work you and the team do in helping us produce information on a range of areas that we hope can develop further over time as HRMI continues to grow. But I guess at this stage, like Chad mentioned, it's time to get to the actual data itself. I know that's what you're all here for. Of course, some of you may have been here to hear my rendition of Mariah Carey's My All. Just kidding, where am I? No. Anyway, the key findings from the 2022 Pacific module. First of all, we have data for about 16 countries, we have data for 16 countries across the Pacific. These countries are listed here in alphabetical order: American Samoa, Australia, the Cook Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, Maui Nui or French Polynesia, Kiribati, New Caledonia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and of course Vanuatu. Now this year we received a total of 272 responses from people across the Pacific, whereby we not only asked respondents to respond to a series of survey questions like Chad intimated around the 5 areas identified, we also allowed respondents the option to provide more detail to help contextualize their responses. Now these open-ended boxes allowed respondents to develop and provide additional detail on the themes, which have been published as qualitative data summaries that are also available for you to view on the Rights Tracker. Now, in general, the data we collected regarding the Pacific module shows a very similar pattern to responses that were delivered in last year's iteration of the survey. This is where I'd like Chad to chime in from time to time. In particular, when it came to giving responses regarding the way the climate crisis was impacting human rights in the Pacific, responses from respondents across many of our countries suggested that it was worsening the ability for our people to enjoy their human rights. Some of the ways respondents told us that the climate crisis was impacting our people related to food security, also impacting the quality of water many people had access to, also the fact that the climate crisis was leading to coastal communities experiencing pressure on housing and shelter, which then can also lead to greater tension in households in other contexts, generating the potential of violence in certain instances. Thus, our respondents were really talking about how this was having a multiplier and cross-cutting effect on people's health, well-being, and even education. In fact, many respondents that also highlighted a greater concern around population displacement as a direct result of the climate crisis. Chad, did you want to chime in here?
Not with a ton of information, just that these are really common themes across countries. A couple of other things that we don't have listed here that have really been exemplified in the data for me is that several countries mention the rising level of various kinds of disease that either we thought were eradicated or we haven't really experienced in this part of the world that are now appearing around, as well as with the concerns around displacement, the rising risk and rising concerns around violence that come with that as resources are more constrained and as people have fewer access to those resources.
Thanks for that, Chad. Yes, absolutely. And in terms of rights to Indigenous sovereignty, it was clear that respondents were very familiar with and working with in many contexts where they stated the impacts of colonization was ongoing in places and in various guises, thus potentially undermining Indigenous sovereignty in their experiences. Certain respondents also mentioned that one way that Indigenous sovereignty comes under pressure is that increasing dependence on foreign aid and outside investors in the region. Was there anything else you wanted to mention here, Chad?
Nothing particular. Once again, it's more, you know, that these themes also are largely exemplified in countries, you know, that are still not only struggling with Indigenous sovereignty, but are struggling with their own sovereignty in light of other colonial powers that still exert a lot of force throughout the region, and that's something that respondents bring up pretty regularly.
Yes, and I think most of us here can understand that context and will have an idea of which locations in the Pacific that applies to, you know, more pertinently. And of course, connected to this is the Indigenous land rights questions. And again, respondents, much like in our previous iterations of the survey, spoke about, again, the impacts of colonization being ongoing and how that sort of materializes, as namely in legacies of colonialism undermining traditional land systems in places, and which can also sit in conflict with introduced land tenure systems as a consequence of this legacy. Some participants or respondents also mentioned land grabbing being an issue, and also highlighted the issue of gendered patterns around land rights, which were also mentioned by quite a few respondents in different contexts.
One thing I would add, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, one thing I would add there is another concept that we see arising in the data is the degree to which the law is sometimes only sort of a paper defense against those that would sort of engage in land grabbing efforts, right? That while many countries in the region have you know, constitutional rights or legal rights that ensure Indigenous access to land and maintenance of land, that oftentimes loopholes are found and other actions are allowed to take place for economic benefit that undermine those very laws. And so that, you know, in general, law isn't enough. The enforcement has to be there as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chad. And I guess in relation to cultural rights, you know, of course, we understand all of these issues being closely aligned, if not interwoven, as with cultural rights, many respondents understood language, right, as being a key cultural right, or access to one's language and the health of one's language. And in many places around the region, a lot of our respondents said that our languages are still widely practiced. However, noted that there is a strong dominance of English and even French in certain spaces, which can impact the status of Indigenous languages in local contexts. So that was all I wanted to share in relation to the data, which again sort of mirrors what we've been seeing in the past two iterations of the survey, Chad.
Yeah, yes, it does.
Yeah. So I guess we want to turn now to this interesting presentation of data that's here around the freedom from violence scores. I think I'd like you probably, Chad, to go over this and explain how this can be read on the rights tracker, oh my goodness, and the comparative aspect and the way that these data are presented here.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I think it's really important to talk about that for just a moment. So these are graphs that are coming directly out of a rights tracker. You can go there right now, and if you go to the rights section at the top and click on any one of these 4 categories of violence, you can see these graphs there, and we'll walk through some of this a little bit later in the next session. But a couple of things that I wanted to note here. One, you'll note that each score isn't just a single score, it's a score with a bar around it. That bar represents our uncertainty about that score. So wider bars represent scores about which we are less certain. Smaller bars represent scores around which we are more certain. If two bars overlap with one another, we at HRMI would probably be unlikely or unwilling to say that those two scores are different, because we can't really say that with any certainty. The kinds of things that would make a bar wider are multiple, but largely it boils down to one of two factors most of the time. It's either that we didn't have a large number of respondents for that country, which tends to expand the level of uncertainty we have in that score, or it's because the respondents for that country told us very different things from one another, which also would obviously increase our uncertainty over what that score is. Now, one thing I want to make clear is, because the freedom from violence data that we collect are limited only to those countries in our Pacific module, you shouldn't read this as an absolute scale. If a country has a really low score on this, and is near the bottom of the scale, that doesn't necessarily mean it would be near the bottom of the scale if compared to every other country in the world. It simply means it's near the bottom of the scale when compared to the other countries that are included in our Pacific data. The same is true for countries with very high scores. A very high score doesn't necessarily mean that country is doing the best it could possibly do at that, or that it's even doing better than most of the countries in the world. It simply means that it's doing better than the other countries that are included in this phase of our data set right now. So in general, this probably is best read as comparative within the region and more comparative within the country, as each of these scores can be compared with one another within the country. So if a country is doing better or receives a better score on children's freedom from violence than it does on the freedom of violence for people with disabilities, then those comparisons can be made. You can say which areas are bigger difficulties for that country, which are less difficulties for that country. But I would encourage you really not to interpret it absolutely, because we just don't know yet. We haven't, this is data that we have for the Pacific, but we don't have for the rest of the world.
Thanks so much for that, Chad. Really interesting, the way that we present the data and how it can be read. I guess, my question for you then is, in relation to what we've seen in previous years, how does this compare in terms of freedom from violence for different groups?
In general, it's a story of consistency, which is, I would say one thing that I would point out that we actually didn't point out when I walked through the methodology earlier is that the Pacific largely outperforms most of the world on things like civil and political rights. The top of our scale is dominated by the Pacific. So, we can't really say how this compares to the rest of the world, but what we can say is that the problems that the Pacific has experienced in past years largely reflected in this year's data. We haven't seen anything that has led to huge sweeping changes across the areas that appear to be problems for countries and the areas that don't seem to be. That's not overly surprising, as we haven't seen broad sweeping changes in the political structure of the countries in the region, or broad sweeping changes in terms of the laws passed to engage with this. So, I think to the degree that there's a message here, I think it's a message of continued vigilance and continued work to try to improve these outcomes for our communities.
Great, thanks so much for that, Chad. Now, we wanted to have a bit of time here for people to ask questions. We've had a procedural question come through in the chat box, but we haven't had anyone ask any questions around the content that we've shared so far. So I'd just like to remind everyone on the webinar, if there is a question that you want to ask, please pop it into the chat. We've got a little bit of time here before we take a break, so everyone can go get a cup of coffee and a cup of tea. We're not talking about easy topics. Human rights are difficult to understand in general, and then now we're adding data to that equation. So I want to give people an opportunity to sort of digest. At this point, maybe I'll ask our fellow panelists if there are any questions that you want to offer Chad and myself, or anything that you would like to mention that we've covered so far, that you would like to add a bit of context around. Oh, we have a question in the Q&A. Oh no, it was a thank you from Alessandra for, yes, we will be sending out the presentation slides to all people who registered for the event. And of course, the recording of this session will also be available on YouTube tomorrow.
I have a question.
Yes, Rona.
Hi, so how has the pandemic affected the data that we collected, say, from end of last year to this year, and the impacts, are the patterns or the changes the same across the Pacific?
That's a
That's a
really
great
good
question.
question. Tad, do you want to chime in? Yeah.
I think I can speak better to how it's affected the collection than I can. I haven't done the analysis, honestly, Rona, and I should to know exactly how much we've seen change in the data themselves. I can tell you that the data collection process has become more difficult, and I think for good reason. It's been I think access to the internet has become more difficult. As a result, I think people have found the space for this kind of work shrinking. That as other issues have come to the fore with the economic impacts of the pandemic, not to mention the health impacts of the pandemic, that people have found that their work assignments and even sometimes their jobs themselves have completely changed over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, which means there are fewer people that have been quite as focused on these issues in the region. And it's made it harder to find respondents. And we've had a harder time, I think, in communicating with respondents. I also think beyond just the basics of communication, the basics of surveys, right? We haven't had the opportunity to sit down with these communities in the way that we did prior to the pandemic. And I think that's really harmful to our data collection process, right? It doesn't allow us to communicate as well as we have in the past. It doesn't allow us to understand as well in the past how we might change things, how things might be improved that would better serve the communities throughout the Pacific. And so it certainly has made things a bigger challenge. We've done the best we can, I think, with this framework, with sort of the Zoom framework and the online framework. But given the costs and difficulty of communicating online throughout the Pacific, right, it's less than we would like. We would love to be out there talking to people in person a whole lot more.
Yeah, and just
Patrick, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, Sam and I had been listening quite intently to the feedback that was coming in from, the region in terms of extending some of the activities that we wanted to do through the Pacific module, including something that I'll talk about a little bit later on, thinking about how we can be a bit more agile on the ground and in the region around how we can collect data that sort of resonates stronger with Pacific ways of knowing and being. Unfortunately, when the lockdowns came in and the borders closed, we weren't able to carry out, anywhere near the amount of work that we wanted to do over the past couple of years. But, sort of dovetailing off of what you've mentioned there, Chad, that has also impacted the wider sort of vision for the Pacific module and the inclusiveness and the meaningful engagement part of the work that we were wanting to develop further. It was just 2 weeks ago where I was finally able to go back to Samoa and actually meet with Rona and others in our team, and that had been almost 3 years. So I think from that perspective, COVID has definitely impacted the kind of works that we wanted to do in the region. And so we're looking forward now to hopefully, brighter horizons. Definitely the horizon's much brighter in the Pacific. It's more beautiful, the sky in the Pacific, but that aside, definitely in terms of moving forward from there. So mahalofa whaitai for your whawhisiri there, Rona. Now, I think at this point, we wanted to take a quick break so everyone can go get a drink of water, maybe coffee like me, or tea, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes so that we can start the next portion of the data launch. Remember to pop in your questions, don't be shy. And grateful that you could rejoin us for part 2 of the data launch. To kick things off, I'd like us to change it up a little bit. I know we've been talking a lot about the technical elements of HRMI's work in the Pacific through the module data, but I also want us to get a sense of how HRMI's data has been used in the Pacific. In the past year in particular, we've seen HRMI workshops run by many of our ambassadors across the Pacific. Here are some of the workshops that have been run by our ambassadors and supported by HRMI. We've also provided support for our ambassadors to be able to do the work that they do whenever and wherever we can. We've also seen a lot of HRMI data being reported in many newspapers and media outlets across the Pacific, with feature stories in the Cook Islands, New Zealand. There's a beautiful story in Stuff this morning on today's release. and we've been quoted in various guises across the region. But to help get a bit more depth about this, I think I'd like to ask someone working in the region, in particular, HRMI's co-ambassador for Samoa and student support manager for the USP Samoa campus, Rona Lee, to come through for a quick talanoa. Talofa, Rona, Soifo Manuela Afionga, how are you today?
Thanks, Patrick. Very good, and I'm very happy to give a little bit of a report on how our internship program has been running, and also chat a little bit about how HRMI data has been reported and how it's being used here in Samoa.
Great. So what's the weather like in beautiful Samoa? I'm really jealous that I'm not there with you.
It's happy hour every hour, so.
That's great. Well, yeah, so thanks for joining me from your campus. I was so lucky to come and visit you a couple of weeks ago. USP Samoa campus is beautiful. I was hoping I could get you to talk about, yeah, kind of what you mentioned earlier, but also maybe could we start with you sharing how HRMI as a group organization has helped you with the work that you're doing in Samoa?
I think, as Anne had mentioned earlier, the importance of having data that's available, and for my work in advocating for access to quality education, this becomes very helpful. So I'm able to tap into data from previous years and sort of see how Samoa's human rights has progressed, and this is how HRMI data becomes useful in my line of work, because when I'm writing proposals for grants, or I'm asking for funding for projects here, for student-led projects here in Samoa, I'm able to tap into HRMI data and use that, because we don't really, there are surveys done, but it's done in silos. So they are targeted at specific topics. So those working in, for example, in media, they mostly survey and focus on the freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And those working in, for example, domestic violence, they do surveys on domestic violence. And those working in climate change, you know, you get the idea. So all of these data are kind of spread out, but it's the good thing about HRMI data, it's in one database and you can access it, and it's public information. So I'm able to cite it and then provide the links to as part of my proposal, so people can actually access and have a look at the data available themselves.
Right, that's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I do know that you have been quite vocal in trying to promote the HRMI data to different people in Samoa. How have people in Samoa that you've been working with, you know, reported on the data or used data, if you have any examples that you can think of?
Yeah, so Samoa Observer, I think, has been one newspaper that has used HRMI data, and it's the only daily print newspaper that we have in Samoa. So they have in previous years used HRMI data, but this is something we need to improve on here in Samoa, is to promote awareness of HRMI data and how it's readily available for anyone who wishes to use it, which is why, as part of our, because our internship is just coming to an end, or it has concluded, the 12-week internship just finished, and we are going to have a HRMI workshop next week on Friday. So this is something that we're hoping to do annually, is to promote HRMI data, and we're inviting the media houses of Samoa, as well as some key stakeholders from the Ombudsman office and some key people that are doing work around human rights, and also a couple of ambassadors will be invited also, and we're hoping for them to attend, because the idea is not for us to promote HRMI data to those who can use them, and also to promote the program so that we can find more funding so we can continue the HRMI USP internship. Because I think this internship has been very instrumental in helping our students, not just those who are studying law, but any of our students who are interested in doing work around human rights. It's been really helpful for them to learn about data, how to interpret it, and how to present it. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that was kind of what I was going to ask you about, was next was about the impact that HRMI is having beyond just the Pacific module data collection. It's also in the internship and the capacity building space. Could you speak to, I know we're going to have a few interns speak a little bit later about their own experience, but you as someone who whose role is developing skills and future aspirations of our young people within the region, could you speak to how the HRMI internship program has assisted you in your role in creating those opportunities for our young people?
Yeah, I mean, in the Pacific, but I can speak specifically for Samoa. What's lacking in our education curriculum is lateral thinking or subjects that encourage critical thinking and lateral thinking. So HRMI, I think, exposes many of our interns into having discussions about topics that they wouldn't normally be asked to discuss in their different disciplines, and also exposes them to other interns who are doing similar work, and learn from other interns around the region and outside of the region. I think it's a very good hands-on experience for them, and also for them to be able to explore different ideas about the same topics, because often we have our students who rote learn topics and rote learning so they would memorize ideas and rote learn ideas from their lectures and what's the resources that's available to them. But I think the internship exposes them to different students from different cultures and different backgrounds, and enable them to engage in conversations and create ideas that are outside their normal spheres. So that's what I enjoy about having HRMI, is I'm also able to have these types of discussions with our students who would normally shy away when I ask them questions about, oh, what are your opinions on this topic? You know, they always behave like I'm going to give them a grade, like I'm going to grade them their opinions about topics, you know, when I'm just asking them questions about what their thoughts are on a topic. So I think HRMI, this is why I'm very passionate about finding more funds and grants to continue this internship, because it's a little bit outside of what they're learning when they come to USP. And in many ways, it's encouraging them to talk about relevant topics that are impacting their daily lives. So climate change and Indigenous rights and land tenure. So topics that they should be thinking about, but our curriculums don't necessarily create pathways for them to have those types of dialogue and conversations. So it's a great internship, and of course it's a dream for me to be able to not just have it here in Samoa, but hoping to open up an internship for the rest of our campuses around the region, because we have about 12 campuses.
Thank you so much for that. One thing that we do are very cognizant of at HRMI is the idea of giving young Pacific peoples the opportunities to connect with other young people and other young human rights defenders and advocates across the world. So networking, but also giving them the tools so that they can develop and follow the aspirations they have for their own selves, their countries, and for their communities. But thank you so much, Rona. It's always a delight to chat with you. And you know, you and I, we can keep going on and on and on. But I guess we've got to move on with the program now. So at this stage, I'd like now to offer the virtual floor to Anne-Marie, who has a few announcements she'd like to make for all of you today. Over to you, Anne-Marie.
Talofa lava, Patrick, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. So as Patrick mentioned earlier, our work in the Pacific kicked off in August 2019 with an incredible co-design workshop, which was hosted at the University of Auckland in the Fale Pacifica, which was a wonderful location. And I'm looking back, I'm just so glad we managed to hold that event then, because it was just 5 months later that COVID-19 started transmitting around the world and in-person events ground to a halt. Fortunately, however, COVID did not get in the way of us recruiting our 2 incredible Pacific data co-leads. Siota Philly, Dr. Patrick Thompson, and Dr. Sam Manuela. Patrick and Sam joined the HRMI team in March 2020, 2.5 years ago. And I just want to take this moment to say a very big thank you to both of you. I know Sam's not on this call right now. He's on a plane to the Cook Islands, but hopefully he'll see this recording. I just really want to thank you both for your incredible contributions to HRMI, in addition to advising on the Pacific module, assisting with engagement across the Pacific, and helping to process and present the data that we collect. We have greatly appreciated all of your clear and direct advice about how HRMI can best be of service in the Pacific, while building our own awareness of our own positionality as non-Pacific people. I personally have grown my own awareness of what it means to support and to grow and to build capacity without overreaching. Plus, you've been really fun to get to know and hang out with. I also want to acknowledge all your incredible mahi outside of the HRMI team. I get the feeling that the HRMI team encountered you just as your careers were really taking off. It has been an absolute delight to see you both awarded many research grants and receive promotions and other recognitions of your talent and hard work. So it is with mixed emotions that I would like to let everyone here know that Patrick and Sam will soon be stepping down from their current roles within the HRMI team. Sam is now managing several big research projects with prestigious grants, and Patrick is moving on to a different Pacific research leadership role at the University of Auckland. That role is yet to be announced, so watch this space. I know we will keep in touch, but we will miss you. I mentioned mixed emotions because at the same time, we are very happy for all the successes that you have enjoyed over the past 2.5 years that have led you to this step. And you've also pointed out that your departure provides an opportunity, which is to devolve leadership of the Pacific module to people based within the Pacific region. And Patrick will be saying more about the new Pacific data lead roles soon. And I hope that many of you here today will consider putting yourselves forward for these unique positions. So just to wrap up, Patrick and Sam, on behalf of the HRMI team, you've been amazing and we are very grateful. A huge thank you to all of us from the HRMI team. And back to you, Patrick.
Oh, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. It's been a great joy to be able to do this work with you, with a team of wonderful, civic-minded, supportive, and caring individuals across the whole team. So thank you so much for those words. And, you know, like you mentioned, this is an opportunity, we think, to grow the module in different directions and give opportunities to other people within the region to be able to lead this work. So Sam and I also have mixed emotions from our conversations as well, but mostly excitement about where to next, which is something that I'll talk about a little bit later on. But as you mentioned, Pacific Data Co-Lead positions are currently open. And, you know, we will be discussing this more in the session with our ambassadors. But just I want to flag that we are hoping to find representation within this within these roles from the 3 main geographic areas of the Pacific, from the West, from the North, and from the South, to really engage and increase the amount of inclusiveness that we have in the work that we do at HRMI. But I'll hand it back to you because you've got some other thank yous to offer, right, Anne-Marie? Anne-Marie, you're muted. You've fallen trapped to that horrible Zoom thing.
Yeah, yes, I also want to say a really big thanks to Zelina Wong and Mariam Rashid, who have been our incredible research assistants working with the Pacific team and helping to process all of the, particularly doing lots of things, but one of the more recent things they've been working on is helping to process all of the qualitative data for the Pacific module. So this is kind of the open-ended information that people put into the text boxes. And when we do a little rights tracker demo soon, you will see some of the summaries of all of that. So huge thank you also to Zelina and Mariam.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Yes, and also my never-ending thanks to Zelina and Mariam as well for the support that they gave us. This past year has been testing for everybody in terms of workload, and having Zelina and Mariam there support us through this process and actually taking the lead in many instances was really wonderful. And Z is actually one of my students, so I've been, you know, just really pleased to see her, you know, flourish in this role, and really grateful for her. So yeah, thanks again, Anne-Marie, for those kind words. Definitely we'll miss working with you, but I don't believe that we will be disconnected moving forward. I think Sam and I will still stay involved and support as much as we possibly can from our new roles, but appreciate you so much. And also I think at this point, it's important for us at HRMI to also acknowledge some other very important people. As you all know, HRMI's work in the region just would not be possible without the care, the support, the offer and hard work of our HRMI ambassadors. So I'd like to hand it over to Pratibha here, who wishes to offer some acknowledgements to our HRMI ambassadors. Pratibha, over to you.
Thanks, Patrick. I know we'll miss you and Sam enormously. I'm really excited to be working with our HRMI Pacific ambassadors more closely in the coming few months. Like Patrick said, our work in the Pacific just wouldn't be possible without the support of our ambassadors. I always say that they're the core of HRMI's Pacific movement, leading human rights measurement for the Pacific and by the Pacific. So just want to take a moment to mihi to our partners in the region and express how truly grateful we are for the partnership and collaboration over the last few years and going forward. We hope to be of greater service to the region. And I know, Patrick, you've already talked through some of the new developments with the HRMI Pacific data lead roles, but if there's anything more you want to say, I'll pass back to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Pratibha. We've got a little section coming up where we will talk about that in a bit more detail. But I think now that we're speaking of new eras and beginnings, I think it's really a great pleasure to be able to move the webinar into this direction, where we're going to bring 2 very special people into the fold. So in 2021, HRMI was able to work with our then funder, which was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Trade here in New Zealand, to begin a HRMI internship scholarship program, providing scholarships for university students and typically less resourced institutions within our region, funding to be able to work as interns and get paid doing so. And the idea being that we would help Pacific students to network with other youth human rights defenders across the world in HRMI's family, and also provide them with experience working with an international NGO. HRMI was able to roll this out in Samoa as a pilot, which we were so lucky to have Rona support us doing, and this proved a huge success in every single way. As such, it is expanding to other USB campuses across the Pacific. And I'd like to bring in again Jenny and Fatima, who introduced themselves at the beginning, to talk about the internship scholarship program in the Pacific. So over to you, Jenny and Fatima.
I would like to acknowledge the presence of all representatives throughout the Pacific and others outside the Pacific as well, invited guests and esteemed audience. I am humbled to be representing Papua New Guinea as an intern with the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, or HRMI for short. I joined the HRMI Internship Scholarship in late May and have learned so much over the short period of time. I was privileged to be selected as an intern in Papua New Guinea. HRMI is a unique collaborative venture between human rights practitioners, researchers, economists, and academics. As most of you are aware, HRMI aims to produce the first comprehensive set of measurements for tracking the human rights performance of various countries. The internship for me is a whole new experience and a very interesting one too. The thing that inspires me about this internship is the exposure and innovative ideas put forward by people around the globe. Doing so, it has taught me how to effectively use Zoom, knowing that PNG is a developing country and we are adapting to new changes, especially new technologies and applications. Also, interpreting data on human rights tracker and working remotely. Therefore, I was privileged to learn the HRMI rights tracker and to actually understand it. In today's world, data is vital, and to learn this important information is the key to make a change. Hence, my team and I here in Papua New Guinea will be doing a presentation on the rights tracker, concentrating on the 2022 PNG's data too. And the presentation will be given out to organizations that might need this valid information for research or in improving human rights here in Papua New Guinea. Therefore, I believe there is more to learn in this internship, and the knowledge gained can be of help in future endeavors. Thank you and God bless. Now back to you, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Fatima, and pushing through with the connection issues. That was really beautiful, and thank you for representing Papua New Guinea. So let's jump across to the other side of the Pacific to Samoa and bring in Jenny. Jenny, are you there?
Yes, hello, thank you, Patrick. Okay, hello for everyone again. Okay, from my own personal view about this internship, I have gained valuable knowledge and experience from this internship, which I got the chance to join Slack for the first time in my life. Wow. And then I learned how to interpret and comprehend the data on the rights tracker and how to present it to other people. But most of all, I enjoyed interacting with different people around the world. An update for our HRMI team here in Samoa, we're having an event which Ms. Brona mentioned, which is next week, and we will be presenting the data to the human rights expert here in Samoa. Hopefully that will go well. And that's basically it from me. And on behalf of our Samoa HRMI team, we would like to thank you all for including us in this internship program. Afitai.
Sorry about that, everyone. I'm having some technical difficulties over here on my side. Mahalo whawhetai, Jenny, for that beautiful sort of recap of what's happening in Samoa. We're really proud of everything that you're doing through, everything that you're doing through the work of HRMI in Samoa, and really excited about the event that you have on next week. for me anyway, I think that one of the proudest achievements through this role and the work that we've done as Pacific Data Co-Lead has been the establishment of the HRMI internship program, especially as it gives opportunities directly to our young people in the region. But now I'd like to hand the mic over to Anne-Marie again, as I'm interested, as I'm sure many of you are as well, you know, to find out how we can actually get to the data on our own and how to read the rights tracker. So for a demonstration of this, Anne-Marie, I'll hand it over to you. And I believe that you're going to be joined again by Jenny and Fatima. So over to you, Anne-Marie.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So I'm just going to share my screen and show you all the rights tracker. Can you see the rights tracker here? So this is the website where we present all of the HRMI data, and it's rightstracker.org. And yeah, you can search on it by countries here, you can search by rights. If you're from perhaps one of the Francophone countries in the Pacific, then you might like to switch the language from English to French. But yes, are there any specific questions that you'd like me to start with?
Yes, Anne. How can we look at the score for a specific country, please?
Yeah, so if you're interested in a particular country, which is the first thing that most people want to do when they come here, you could either search for it by typing its name in here, or you could search in this box here. So let's say I want to search for Samoa, for example. Then that will take me directly to the Samoa page, and every country has a page. And this first page that you come to, it will always have you land on this at a glance page, which gives you a very high level overview of Samoa's scores in these three main areas: the quality of life, safety from the state, and empowerment rights. And then you can switch across to get more information about each of these by moving to the different tabs. So here I switched over to quality of life, and you can get a lot more information here. I'm not going to go into this in detail now because the main focus of this session is on the Pacific module data. I just want to let you know that it's there. Same thing, you can jump over to safety from the state. You know, and it's always lovely to see countries where a lot of their scores are in this category that's called good. And so, you know, it's great to see Samoa performing so well on many of these safety from the state rights. We don't see that in many countries around the world. Empowerment rights, not quite so good. And so would be happy to talk about that perhaps in the Q&A if anyone's interested. And you can also then move to the people at risk tab as well.
Thank you, Anne.
Do you have another?
How about, yeah, sorry. How about if I want to see the scores for the Pacific module for my own country, please?
Yeah, so there we would just jump over to the final tab here, Pacific region data. And so this is what the main focus of today's webinar has been on. And you can see at the top, there's some little shortcut jumps to the 5 main subject areas that the Pacific module asks questions about: climate crisis, Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous land rights, cultural rights, and violence. So for example, if I click on Indigenous lands, it will jump me down to that section, or you can just scroll down and see the answers to each question. To what extent do people in Samoa enjoy their cultural rights? And then the final, all of these scores are presented on a scale, on this 1 to 6 scale, with the exception of the right to freedom from violence answers. And these ones are presented in the same way as our civil and political rights data scores. So you can see to what extent are people in Samoa free from violence in the community, and you can look at that then for each of the different groups that we ask questions about. The other thing I just want to draw attention to here is that is the qualitative responses. So when survey respondents are filling in the survey, we provide some open text boxes in the survey where we ask people to tell us more details about, for example, on this particular case, about Indigenous land rights in Samoa. And I'm just wondering perhaps if there's someone on the panel who might like to jump in and say a few words about some of the qualitative, someone from Samoa who would like to say something about some of these qualitative data that you can see here.
I might be able to assist with that.
Yeah,
That's
great.
Okay. Yeah, I think like with the climate crisis, I can say definitely there's the large majority of Samoans live inland, not so much on the coastal areas. So perhaps that's why the data might be a little bit high, because traditionally Samoans live inland. And throughout the course of history, the reason why we ended up with so many coastal villages was because of trade when the Europeans arrived. So I guess that's why the data might be more positive than it actually is, because most people are living inland anyways. And I think what might be helpful is to include comments from people in the tourism industry, because they're the ones that are highly affected. In terms of,
I see that in the qualitative responses, it's pointed out some of the extreme, the effect of extreme weather events and access to clean water and so forth. So I think some of the impacts do seem to be being pointed out here.
Yes. And in terms of Indigenous sovereignty, I mean, not a lot of it's written in our constitution anyways, that 80% of our lands are communal lands. So it's not so much an issue. I think Indigenous sovereignty and human rights around sovereignty, I think this is something that the Samoa diaspora are more worried about than Samoans living in Samoa, as well as I think the conversations around sovereignty is more at the national levels when it comes to developing partners and donor partners. So those conversations are, I think, from the outside in, there are questions about sovereignty and the fear of losing sovereignty because China is taking over the Pacific, those types of comments. But it's great to have the qualitative data, because I think this is the type of information that our media needs to use to report on. Because that's also something that's lacking in the Pacific is investigative reporting. But the HRMI data, because it's so great that there's the data and then there's the qualitative responses, so they can literally quote HRMI and what people are saying on the local front.
Thank you so much, Rona. I think we've got time for one more question from Jenny.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so how can we look at the scores in the Pacific module and then compare it to other countries?
Yeah, so there's two ways. So for the scores that we have that can be compared with other countries are the violence scores. So you can either get there by clicking here, so that would take us to the children data, or you can go up to this rights menu. And if you scroll down past all the quality of life rights and past all of these civil and political rights, then you have these 4 rights here: right to freedom from violence against children, people with disabilities, women and girls, rainbow community. I'm going to click on right to freedom from violence against children. And this chart here then compares scores for 13 countries that we collected information for calendar year 2021. And you can see a ranking here. If you click on this little back arrow, you can go backwards and see the previous year's data. So you can see last year we had data for 19 countries. And I think actually, I see that this is brand new update to the rights tracker, and it looks as though there's some not available NAs turning up here. They shouldn't be there, so we'll have to get that fixed. But the point I'd like to make is that last year we managed to collect data for a larger number of countries than for this year. And I think that kind of reflects some of the comments that were made earlier about the impact of the pandemic on our ability to engage across the region. And so hopefully this number will go up again next year. And you can switch and look at different communities. For example, if we want to look at MVP FAF plus communities, then we will get this chart. So I think I've probably used up my time allocation for demonstrating the Pacific module data, but so back to you, Patrick.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie and Jenny, for that demo of the rights tracker. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so I think what I'm going to do is actually just go quickly into the Q&A to make sure that we can answer any unanswered sort of questions, just to, because many of you will be looking to move on to other engagements at midday. So just opening up the Q&A here, we have a question. From Susan, looking across the Pacific, are there particular rights that the Pacific countries tend to do well on relative to the rest of the world, relatively poorly on? So that's a great question. And I think, Chad, I might ask you to respond to Susan's question, seeing you're the most intimately familiar with the global data.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm happy to do that. I mean, it's a relatively quick answer, and I referenced this a little bit earlier, that the Pacific tends to dominate the top of our civil and political rights scales. Among the countries we have in there, I mean, this isn't unanimous. There are countries in the Pacific that do struggle with civil and political rights, and we did see some change in some countries last year. I believe. We were looking at Samoa's page earlier, and Samoa scores on empowerment rights, for instance, political participation, assembly and association, and expression and opinion, right, fell a little bit last year. I believe in association with some of the things that happened around the election last year. But for the most part, the Pacific does really, really well on both our measures of safety from the state, as well as those empowerment rights, and tends to dominate those scales in a way when compared with the rest of the world that other regions just don't. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Chad. We had a question from Alessandra. I think it's about methodology relating to the way that we separate indicators and clusters. And the question was around whether we could explain the process of creating the indicators and the challenges in collecting data for them. They're working on an assignment at the moment, so obviously it would be great to kind of get insights from people who are doing this work when you're doing that, kind of assignment stuff. I understand I'm a lecturer, students are trying to do assignments, but I'm wondering, we've got a lot of responses here already from Anne-Marie and I think from Talia, but I'm wondering if you wanted to add anything or could give like a quick response to that question, Chad?
Sure. I mean, I think, the clusters that you see on the website, I mean, the easiest description of why they're clustered the way they are, right, is really that it's sort of intimately tied to international law and the way that these clusters are grouped in international law. So I think I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the way we measure economic and social rights, that we measure those using a different methodology than the way we measure civil and political rights. And part of that is due to information availability. That's some of the reasoning why those methodologies are different. But another one of the really big reasons is that in law, their obligations are actually quite different. And what countries are expected to do for economic and social rights is quite different than what they're expected to do for civil and political rights, largely due to the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, for economic and social rights, states are expected to do the best they can with to the maximum of their available resources. Whereas with civil and political rights, any violation of civil and political rights is seen as a violation of their immediate obligations. I actually think there's a great, really deep conversation to be had as to whether the civil and political rights obligations are as realistic and as they could be. And that's worth a discussion some other time, I think. But the groupings largely come from there because the initial groupings of these these different dimensions really came directly from international law. But also, if you're a student working on those projects, always feel free to reach out to Hermie. Like as you can see in the Q&A there, we've got tons and tons of resources online that can explain this stuff better.
Thanks so much, Chad. Yeah, you know, we are running out of time, but I did want to mention quickly before we did log off, two things. First thing is, if you have any sort of lingering questions from today's sessions, feel free to put them in the chat now. We'll do our best to respond as soon as we can. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to contact anyone in the Hermie team via email. Chad is always really generous with his time around methodology questions. So, you know, you're open. I know you're open to receiving emails in that vein. I just wanted to mention quickly where to next. For a lot of our ambassadors who are going to be coming through to the Talanoa this afternoon with myself and Sam, once Sam clears customs and is in the Cook Islands proper, where to next for us? Well, the first thing I'd like to mention is that we've already sort of intimated that the first 3 years of the Pacific module were funded by New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, funding that we're really, really grateful for. That agreement, however, ended earlier this year, and in its place, we are now being funded by the US Embassy in New Zealand office. So first of all, a shout out to the wonderful people in the US Embassy, including Wesley and his team, for acknowledging the great work Hermie does through the Pacific module and offering to fund the continuation of our work. And also a big whawhetai to MFAT for all their support over the past 3 years. As such, the shift in funding may mean a shift in some of the foci of the Pacific module work and Hermie's work in the Pacific in general, which is why that Talanoa for us is really important to kind of get a sense of how everyone in the region is feeling about the work that we're doing. You know, we are a responsive and agile team, and in the past, we've been listening to our ambassadors and many of you on the ground in the Pacific, holding Talanoa with so many different people, and following up with our ambassadors. And now in one of those Talanoa, a key issue, actually not in one, in all of the Talanoa, a key issue that always came up was how the Pacific module may better incorporate Pacific ways of knowing and being, ways of knowing and being that are inherent to the uniqueness of our cultures and knowledge systems. So although we sort of understand that surveys provide us with enormously useful insights and data, you know, they're not possible in terms of being able to account for the whole picture or context or experience, which is not what surveys are designed to do anyway. I know this, you know this, Chad knows this. Sam and I's vision was always that we would consider developing additional research projects in the region that got to the heart of how human rights was not just being monitored in local settings, but understood by different communities and peoples across the region. So there is still hope that in the future, if funding were to be found, we would see Hermie's work also become localized through the piloting of smaller, more in-depth scale qualitative data generation that could address the question around how we best bridge the divide between indigenously Pacific understandings of sovereignty and human rights versus the traditional framework of human rights that come from the quote-unquote West, that in many ways also comes into the region under the ires and suspicions of paternalism and lingering imperialism, the things that we've kind of mentioned already. So we hope in the future Hermie's work can incorporate this further. So in short, Sam and I have heard everyone's feedback. We hope that now that the COVID-induced interruptions to our work program are slowly lifting, the new data leads will work with potentially new funders. We need new funders, by the way, to advance these aspirations and the aspirations of our people through the Hermie work. So at this point, I've done a lot of talking, and you know, I just really wanted to express my immense gratitude for all of you staying with me, and I'd like to invite all the panelists to come through as well to see if anyone has any final comments or any questions, and I'll just check the chat box to see if we've got any other questions for Q&A. It doesn't look like it. Is there anything anybody else would like to mention before we end today's session? Looking around, it doesn't seem like that's the case. Rona, I see you.
Thank you so much, Anne and Chad, and for starting Hermie. What you probably didn't imagine that it will impact lives, but it has. We've had up to 18 students now from Samoa that HRMI has assisted financially and also with expanding their knowledge on the work done around human rights. And I think without your passion and your commitment to getting HRMI together, we wouldn't benefit from this work. And thank you so much, Dr. Patrick, for your consistent passion in advocating for anything that benefits Pacifica people. And I think we owe all of you hugs from Samoa, and we hope to host the HRMI workshop for everybody here in Samoa. And we hope to welcome you all here. Hawhitai tele lava, we are immensely grateful. And as a Pacific educator, I cannot words enough to express my sincere gratitude for the work that you're doing, because it's impacting life and it's changing lives, especially our young Pacifica people. Hawhitai tele lava.
Mahalo lava. Thank you, Rona. Appreciate that. And we just had a question come through from Harpreet in the Q&A around what gaps have we identified during the data collection. I think we could respond to that from multiple different angles. I'm not 100% sure sort of which way you want us to look at that. Is that kind of in the data collection process, or gaps in terms of human rights sort of measurements? Chad, do you have any idea how you might want to respond to this question?
I mean, it's sort of like you said, there's a number of different angles. I mean, I think one I referred to earlier with the difficulties of collecting data in human rights areas that we don't have international data sets to rely on. I think Susan and the economic and social rights team probably have their own answers to this question about data that are perhaps missing for some countries that we don't currently have access to. And then, finally, the thing I will always point out is that we're not covering the whole of internationally recognized human rights yet at HRMI. We have a good start, but there are many, many rights that we're not covering, both if we think in terms of things like labor rights. But, one of the things that I still would love to see us get back to someday that was discussed pretty frequently at our Pacific workshop back in 2019 was covering the rights in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, right? Which we are largely not covering. We're certainly not covering it for the world, and we're covering a limited scope of that in the Pacific module right now. So I think there are also just really large gaps in the rights that we're currently covering that we would love to get to someday.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, I think this is a great time for us to wrap up. I know it's been more than 90 minutes, longer than we had planned for. I just want to again express my thanks to everybody for being here with us today, to all the panelists for sharing your time, your knowledge, your aloha, and your care for everybody in the team. And so once again, for the final time, I would like to close today's Pacific Data module launch and encourage you all to enjoy and work with the HRMI data as you move forward. So mahalo whakatau everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the world. Soifua.